When I first moved to the city, I was desperate for a place to live. I had just landed a job that barely covered my expenses, and after weeks of searching, I found a listing that seemed too good to be true. A small apartment in a decent neighborhood at an unbelievably low rent. The ad didn't include pictures, but I was in no position to be picky. I called the number, and a man with a deep, quiet voice answered. He told me he was the landlord and that if I could meet him that evening, the place was mine. No background checks, no deposits, just first month's rent in cash. That should have been a red flag, but I was too eager to care. When I arrived at the address, I realized why it was so cheap. The building was old, crumbling, with vines growing up the cracked brick walls. The street was almost silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. It felt abandoned. The landlord was already waiting for me outside. He was a tall, thin man, dressed in a long coat despite the warm weather. He didn't smile when I introduced myself, just nodded and gestured for me to follow him inside. The apartment itself was odd. The walls were a dull yellow, the air smelled stale, and the wooden floors creaked with every step. There was only one window and it was nailed shut, but it was furnished, and I needed a place. I handed over the cash, and without another word, he handed me the key and left. That night, I woke up to a sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the pipes, but then I realized it was coming from inside the apartment, from the closet. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The tapping stopped. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I inspected the closet. It was empty except for an old wooden chair in the corner. I hadn't noticed it before. That night, the tapping started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I turned on the light and stared at the closet, willing myself to ignore it. But then, the doorknob moved. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed the landlord's number. Straight to voicemail. I left a panicked message and spent the night curled up on the couch, every light in the apartment on. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to break my lease, find somewhere else, and figure things out later. But when I opened the closet door, the chair was gone. In its place, there was a set of deep scratch marks on the inside of the door. I left immediately, booked a motel for the night, and tried calling the landlord again. No answer. The next day, I went back to get my things. The door to the apartment was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was heavy, thick with something rotten. My belongings were untouched, but in the center of the living room stood the chair from the closet, and sitting in it was a figure. It was a man. His skin was gray, almost translucent, his eyes sunken, lips cracked. He wore the same coat as the landlord. I couldn't move. My body refused to listen to me. Then, in a voice that barely sounded human, he whispered, "You paid for the month. You should stay." That was all it took. I ran. I left everything behind. I don't even remember how I got out, just that I was suddenly outside, gasping for air. The police didn't take me seriously when I tried to report it. They went to check the building, but the apartment I described, it didn't exist. The address belonged to an abandoned lot. No building, no landlord, just an empty, weed-filled space that had been that way for decades. I moved to another city after that. I never tried to look up the listing again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is silent, I still hear the tapping.